Well, good morning to you all. I am Paulo, the director of the Brazil Institute here at the Wilson Center. Uh, it's a pleasure to have you here this morning, and it's an absolute honor to have three colleagues, dear friends, dear personal friends, and great colleagues to discuss basically the first round of presidential elections and where do we go from there. There is a clear choice between right and left, although as we may hear, as far as the economic agenda, probably the two candidates could get together and put together a program pretty compatible, particularly in terms of opening the Brazilian economy. But Monica will talk about that. Monica de Boll will be one of the commentators, so will Antonio Brito, please, who, and Fernando Rodrigues. Let me explain who they are. Fernando Rodrigues is an award-winning journalist from Brazil. Actually, Brito and I were in New York just 2 days ago to see him receive the Maria Moores Cabot Gold Medal for the excellent work he has done as a Brazilian journalist, not only in investigative journalism. He is one of the founding members of the body that congregate investigative journalists in Brazil that has worked in things such as the Panama Papers and other very serious endeavor. More important to the press, given the change in the business model of media. Fernando Rodrigues, that has a bunch of awards as a journalist in Brazil, especially the Prêmio ESSO, the most important. He has three or four of those. He was let go after working for many years in Folha de São Paulo. Why? Because of the change in the business model. But he took the change in business model literally and decided that he was going to help it change even further. And he started a news platform that is now a great success, makes money, employs 40 journalists. It's called Poder 360. And it is now a very important, I think, Poder 360 probably employs more people, journalists in Brazil today, than the regional offices of the main newspapers in Brazil, the traditional newspapers. So Fernando was a correspondent here. He was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. Is a dear friend. And he had the good sense of getting both Monica de Boll and Antonio Brito to be columnists of that publication. Monica, you may be familiar with her. She is an economist. She is now the professor. She leads the Latin American Studies Department at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University, also a fellow at the Peterson Institute. And why not say when she arrived in Washington a few years ago, she was a global fellow here at the Wilson Center. She's a very dear friend. We talk a lot, probably every day, and to understand what's going on. She just published a few hours ago, in the New York Times Online, an article about the economic challenges Brazil faces ahead, either Haddad or Bolsonaro winning the election. Antonio Brito is probably the most successful of my colleagues. As journalists, we were together in, I started before he started, but I'm not going to give you the date. But we met as journalists in the 70s, early 70s. From there, he became He was a very important and influential television commentator for global television. From that, he became the spokesperson for the first civilian president of Brazil, the one that tragically died before his inauguration, Tancredo Neves. He was a member of the Constituent Assembly that in 1988 gave Brazil its current constitution, which the 30th anniversary of that was celebrated, of the Constitution was celebrated just last week. By the way, we are coming out with a publication on that by one of our scholars, Oscar Vilhena, Dean of the Getúlio Vargas Law School in São Paulo. But not happy with being a Constituent Assembly, a presidential spokesperson, he became a minister of Social Security, and he ran and was elected governor of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, the southernmost state in Brazil, and the state where Brazil actually Gaúchos are the people that decided to be Brazilians. They could be something else. They could be Uruguayans or Argentinians, but they are. A friend of ours, a great author, Josué Guimarães, a great writer from Rio Grande do Sul, who I was a correspondent with him in Portugal in the 70s, and he used to say, Paulo, you should understand this. In Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul has history. The rest of Brazil has a bunch of geography. So just the Gaúchos are very proud people. But Brito was a governor for one term, and then after that he went into business. He was the president of the Trade Association for the Pharmaceutical Industry, and in that capacity we met again, and we ran together a program on innovation. Major issue in Brazil. Brazil produces very good science and very little innovation. We have a book coming out in English. We have it already in Portuguese. Is Novos Caminhos para a Inovação, written by a Brazilian expert on the issue, Fernando de Negri. But we offered some of the texts, including Monica's article. We also put out a text on a comparative study or discussion, or workshop we had here on May 23rd, comparing the crisis of the state, the so-called administrative state, as it's called here, Brazil and the United States, because the crises are very interesting and similar in nature. They are obviously, the elements are different, and it's a pleasure to see here the president of the Brazilian National School of Public Administration, who brought that effort to us, Francisco Gaetani, a model civil servant in Brazil who was deputy minister of the environment before he headed the school for the last term. So with that, the way we are going to do this, I will invite Fernando to start us off and explain what happened in the first round of presidential election. Then I'll invite Monica to give us the economic picture, and Brito to explain what are the sort of the deeper meaning of the political change in Brazil. I describe this as a tsunami. There is a lot of changes going. We don't know where they're going to lead us because the party structure in Brazil, the political system that was already exhausted, basically imploded. And we have to figure out how to move forward with the remnants of that. With that, I would like to invite Fernando to start us off. Fernando, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Paulo, for your kind words, and thank you very much for having me here today. Great pleasure to be here with Monica, whom I have known from what she writes for us and for other publications. It's great to be here, and together with my friend Antonio Brito for many years, source of inspiration to all of us. down there with his articles for Poder 360. I would, without being, well, risking being a little bit dull, but I would like to talk a little bit about history, Brazilian's recent history. If you think of Brazil and the Latin American as a whole, we are in the infancy of our democracy. It's roughly just 30 years that we've been a democratic country. And that's just a tiny drop in the history's bucket when you think of it. If you think of the first 30 years of democracy in the United States, it was a very effervescent time for this country here, and it is for other countries that are venturing in democracy like Brazil. So there's always this way to see things like the cup is half full, half empty. I tend to see it's a bit of both. When you think that when Dilma Rousseff was inaugurated 4 years ago, approximately, on the 1st of January of 2015, that was a historical record for Brazil. We've never had before 7 direct elections for president with the winner being inaugurated right after. That should have happened 100 years before, approximately, with Rodrigues Alves, but he died before he could be inaugurated because he caught, I think, was Spanish fever or something like that. So we never had that before. That gives you a flavor of how young the Brazilian democracy is. And in a way, how strong it is as well. We survived and endured the impeachment of the first president elected by direct vote after the dictatorship, Fernando de Mello, in 1992. I remember at that time, and Brito might remember that too, there was so many talks about, there's going to be a setback. The military will come back. This is a very turbulent time, and will democracy survive? And we had all that kinds of doubts in our minds at that time in 1992. We had hyperinflation at that time. We were having a moratorium with our external debt. Our image was, below zero, international image of Brazil. And we survived. Then came Fernando Henrique, Itamar Franco, Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Then again, back in 2002, when Lula was elected for the first time as president, there was all this buzz in the markets about what is going to happen if this leftist is the winner. And actually what happened afterwards was that democracy was solid in place. We had big scandals for sure. But life went on, and then Dilma Rousseff was elected. Then we had a big problem with the economy, as we all know. Then she was impeached. And then again, there were so many talks about, there might be some setbacks now. Democracy is not functioning well. But we are having now, for the 8th time in a row, a direct election for president with roughly the same rules in place. Nothing has changed that much. Every 4 years, there is an election for president and for the governors of the states of Brazil. There are 26 states plus this federal district where Brasilia is. So what I think is, of course, these are difficult times because the two candidates, the two ones that are running for president on the 28th of October are on the extreme poles of the political spectrum, as we know. But I don't see, except that we don't have any idea of how the winner might conduct the economy in the 4 years to come. But we have had that before. We didn't know how actually Dilma would do with the economy. Actually, she did very badly, as we know. We didn't know how, in the day before Fernando Collor was going to be inaugurated, I remember the feeling of defeat amongst all journalists in Brasilia. I was based in São Paulo at that time, but I went to Brasilia for a week to cover the inauguration. At that time, the inauguration was in March. And I remember on the 14th of March, the day before he would be inaugurated, that was 15th of March of 1990, nobody knew what the Collor plan actually would be. Paulo might remember that, and Brito as well. We didn't know. We were completely in the dark. And then came a disaster, as we know. And to my surprise at that time, not now anymore, the Congress supported that. The most stupid idea I ever adopted.
Explain what that was, because the Americans
Probably
are not
people
familiar.
yeah.
This would be
confiscated all the money of the economy. Like,
Yes.
Yeah, basically that.
savings.
In a
Just
nutshell.
You
Yeah.
have a savings account.
May I say something?
Yes, savings account, confiscation. You don't have access to your
Yeah,
bank
so
account.
what happened was that, as
Simple.
most of you probably know, Brazil was going through a very severe bout of hyperinflation. It had been going through that during most of the 80s, but there were at the time mechanisms in place that pretty much controlled the rate by which prices were increasing on a monthly basis. By the time you got to the 1990s, prices were increasing per month at a rate of about 20 to 30% per month, which was obviously per year a 4-digit inflation rate. And when Collor came into government, he had this fantastic, terrible idea of reducing the amount of money in circulation in the economy, because the idea being that if you reduce the amount of money in circulation, then people don't have money to buy things. And if they don't have money to buy things, if they can't consume, then obviously prices have to go down. Except that, of course, what that creates is a big social upheaval, because people, feel that they're being robbed. And secondly, it tanks the economy, which is exactly what happened. There was a very massive recession. So,
Okay, so just an advice: if the United States ever goes to a hyperinflation, don't try that.
Don't do that. That's not a good idea. No, yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Fernando, go back.
That's true, yeah. And if I may add something, in March of 1990, the monthly inflation in Brazil, the monthly inflation rate in Brazil was 80% when he was going to be inaugurated. So it was a terrible situation, but he decided and he adopted that policy, and Congress followed suit and supported it in full, actually. And he was elected by this very tiny party that even doesn't exist anymore, called PRN at that time. And immediately after he was sworn in, he had more than 300 congressmen supporting him. And that is what is going to happen if the far-right candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, wins on October the 28th. I have no doubt in my mind that he will have like approximately 300 to 350 congressmen supporting him in the House, in the Brazilian Congress. So that's something that should be noted. So is that good or not? It depends on which policies he's going to adopt, because he's going to be supported just right after he is inaugurated. So that said, I would like to show you the story of the Brazilian elections. If we can put on the poll aggregator. we have been aggregating all the polls in Brazil. When some analysts, and including us journalists, poses a little bit surprise of what happened at that time, yeah, it's loading in. That's all that. You're going to see the curves. This story is being told for the past approximately 18 months, actually, when you see if the curves show up there. He has been leading the polls for more than a year. And I think, well, okay. What I was going to say is it's, in a way, history is repeating itself because here in the United States you had not the same situation, but a very similar situation when Donald Trump was at a certain point being portrayed just as something that would not happen when the time came. But then when the election day approached, Donald Trump was elected. When you see those curves, those are hundreds of opinion polls, election polls in Brazil. Bolsonaro was leading all the way. And I remember listening to those armchair analysts on TV in May, June, saying, well, he has reached his ceiling, he's not going to survive up the day of the election, he's going to be defeated, he's the one who is going to lose to any other candidate. And that public discourse from the media, in a way, from us, lead us to this situation right now, I think. I think the media has something to do with all this as well, because we didn't take that, well, actually we took for granted that Bolsonaro was not going to be able to go to this point where he is right now, leading the polls, and he's actually a virtual winner of this election cycle. Unless a very unexpected event occurs, he will win on the 28th of October. So that's just a phenomenon that has happened here in a way in the United States and is taking place in Brazil right now. That curve shows you that it was pretty much predictable what was going to happen. And but most, not all, but most of the analysis that you would find on the media was that, well, he is not for real. He will be defeated by anyone who goes with him to the second round of the presidential election. The other chart I would like to show you is the impact of what we call in Brazil Bolsa Família, which is the most important social program. It's not the Excel, no, the other one. Yeah, the PDF, yeah. This is a social program that has been in place for more than 20 years, actually, and took off when Lula was president, and there you see the map shows us that this is all in Portuguese. I will translate for you. The northern part of Brazil, which is marked in dark red or orange, are the states where more families are beneficiaries of Bolsa Família. And the south is the region of the country where you have less families dependent on Bolsa Família. For you to have an idea, 58% of the families in the state of Maranhão receive Bolsa Família. That's 58%. And then you see the the way Dilma Rousseff performed in 2014 was, in most places, better than the way Fernando Haddad performed right now in 2018. And that explains a little bit why PT, the Workers' Party, is not doing well. And then when we go down on this image, then you see a little bit more. Then you're going to see where Bolsonaro is doing well. And that chart explains us why he's leading all the polls. He performed much better than the other blue candidate from 2014, Aécio Neves, performed in those states where they are supposed to win. There is a direct correlation between vote and the existence of Bolsa Família in Brazil. And this time, the Workers' Party has not been able to perform as well as Lula and Dilma Rousseff did in past elections. So that shows us why this is changing the landscape, the political landscape in the country. It's, in a way, the reduction of the impact of Bolsa Família, the social program, on the vote of the people, because we have been under a recession, either a recession or a stagnation of the economy in the past 3.5 years. Unemployment rate is around 12% nationally, but when you have the unemployment rate for young people from 18 to 24 years old, the unemployment rate in Brazil right now is 25%. And the young people in Brazil would be the most engaged ones in election, in campaigns for their candidates all along in the whole country. And they are the ones, the more outspoken ones for Bolsonaro. There are lots of young people actually doing campaign for him, supporting his campaign and being very active on social media. With that, I'm going to come to a conclusion saying that I think Bolsonaro will win. That's the first point. Secondly, I think that will lead Brazil into a very difficult time because he doesn't have a clear-cut program for the economy. It's not clear how he's going to implement what his economic minister, Paulo Guedes, he has already said that Paulo Guedes, a liberal economist in Brazil, will lead the economy. And third, although we are not so sure what is going to happen, I think he's going to have a lot of support from Congress in the first at least 6 months of 2019. What he's going to do with that support, I don't know. Nobody knows. Actually, neither him would know right now. And I don't see any chances at this point in time to change that that outcome for the presidential election in Brazil this month of October. So that's basically how I see the political scenario right now, Paulo. And perhaps we can open for some comments later on.
We'll have Monica and Brito will make brief presentation. But remember, you heard here and in many other places that remember how the Workers' Party used Bolsa Família to sort of control the electorate, and they would win elections forever in Brazil because of the way basically they were buying votes through Bolsa Família. So think again. That doesn't work anymore, as Fernando demonstrated. The other thing I wanted to, couple of things that are important just in the past few days. The Workers' Party, you know the color is red. Just after the first round of elections, the propaganda, the ads, have mysteriously turned to yellow and green, and the image of former President Lula, that was always in the picture of the propaganda, vanished. Mr. Haddad, who was going every Monday to Curitiba, where the former president is serving a 12-year prison sentence for corruption, skipped the visit last Monday. I think this shows the impact of all of this. Personally, I think that it's thinking too little of the Brazilian electorate, just to change the color and to, get rid of Lula. Clearly, this is not going to have any impact. So here we go. Now we'll hear from Monica about the parts that the two candidates completely disagree. If we add, I don't know if we know what their plans are.
Can't disagree on what they don't have.
Yeah, see, and that's and they may agree on something also in as far as the state intervention in the economy. And one more point: Sunday evening, a first interview, or no, Monday, national television interview. Mr. Bolsonaro asserted his authority because his candidate for vice president, his running mate, is a 4-star retired general who had varied ideas about, for instance, the Constitution that I mentioned just turned 30. He was going to have a new one, okay? Because that one is no good for a variety of reasons. So Mr. Bolsonaro, which is interesting, said that, he was a captain. He ended his military career at the level of captain. This other one is a 4-star general. And he said, I'm a captain, he's a general, but I'll be the president. And there will be no change in the Constitution. So reality may have an impact in people's thinking. The Brazilian Constitution, according to the person that is most likely to be the next president, is going to be the same that we have today. And probably may be amended or not, but there is a process for that. As Fernando has just mentioned, there is, believe it or not, it is a democracy. Monica, give us the economic picture, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paulo. Thank you to my distinguished colleagues here on the panel. Let me start off with this idea that Bolsa Familia doesn't work anymore, just to qualify it in two respects. The first is, as we know, Brazil has gone through, in 2015 and 2016, the worst recession on record. And there has been, because of the country's very difficult economic situation, what happened with Bolsa Familia is really that there was no readjustment of Bolsa Familia. In 2015, Brazil had a recession and also had to remove a number of price freezes that the Rousseff government had introduced. And when that happened, inflation shot up to nearly 11% that year. Of course, Bolsa Familia was not readjusted by 11%. So there was a massive lag in the readjustment of Bolsa Familia, in that now when you look at Bolsa Familia in real terms, even though there was a small adjustment under the Temer administration, what people are actually receiving is not much at all, and much, much less than what they used to receive in the past. So part of the reason, I think, why we have seen, this disappearance in a way of Bolsa Familia as being a major political factor in Brazil is because Brazil hasn't had the money to pay Bolsa Familia, or hasn't done. Actually, it does have the money to pay Bolsa Familia, but it has not readjusted Bolsa Familia to the extent that it might have because of the problems that have plagued the country. So that's and I'll go through some of those problems in a second. So that's one point I wanted to make. The second point that I want to make is about the figure of Mr. Bolsonaro himself. We have to understand him, and I think we're going to spend a lot of time trying to understand what exactly he represents. But in many ways, in many, many ways, he's a very typical populist. Take a break. That word, populist, populism. That's something that confuses a lot of people because political scientists have one interpretation of what populism means. Economists have a different interpretation of what populism means. The general public has another idea of what populism means. It gets very confused when you try to actually define populism. So let me use a very simple explanation for what populism is. Populism is many things, but if there's one thing that populists always do, is that they try to turn very complex problems and subsume them in extremely simple messages, and messages that really resonate with the electorate. So in the past, in Brazil and in other places in Latin America, whenever you saw populists or populist messages, they always had to do with some magic formula that these governments were going to put in place to redistribute income. That was the typical thing that happened under Perón. That was the typical thing that happened under Vargas, and you have many other instances of that happening in the region. This time around, we have a populist that isn't talking about income distribution. He's talking about something else that has become hugely relevant for the Brazilian electorate, and that's the issue of violence, public security, and law and order. And again, he has very simple solutions to deal with these things. His main solution is give people firearms, get the police into the communities where there is a lot of narco trafficking or there are a lot of criminals. Just make the police, go after these people. And Brazilians, because they are living through, especially the Brazilian middle class, which is very much living in fear of the level of violence that some major Brazilian cities are facing, have pretty much bought that message as, okay, fine, everything has failed to date. Every single government action to combat violence has failed. So here's a message. I kind of buy that. Plus, I don't want the PT back in power. So this sounds like a good thing. Why am I saying these things? Because to do a sort of a deep dive now into the economy and what a populist means for the economy, a populist is never someone who is going to deliver the kind of painful economic reforms that countries need. They never do that. I have yet to see a populist that has actually implemented reforms. If they do, they're not a populist because the reforms are not popular. So they can't be populist by definition, by construction. So if we understand Mr. Bolsonaro as a populist, but as a different kind of populist than what we've seen in the region, because he's not talking about income distribution, he's talking about other issues, then we have to try to connect the dots with what that means for the economy. Brazil right now has pressing problems on the fiscal front. So there's a deficit. It's a deficit that right now, in nominal terms, so when you include debt service obligations, it's a deficit that's hovering around 9% of GDP. It's very high. The primary deficit is hovering around 2.5% of GDP, which is also high, especially because it is much higher than the country's growth rate. The country's growing at about 1%. Perhaps 1.5%. I think it's more 1 than 1.5. But in any event, the primary deficit is way above the growth rate. And interest rates are also high in real terms. So when you put all of this together, what it means is that debt to GDP, which is currently high at about 85%, this is according to the IMF, the Brazilian Central Bank calculates gross public debt differently, and obviously that number is lower. But the IMF number is really the one to use because it's the one that you can compare internationally. That number can actually rise in the next 2 years easily to about 100% of GDP without much happening. So if the economy doesn't grow much beyond what it's doing right now, if there is no fiscal adjustment, and if real interest rates, that is the difference between nominal interest rates and inflation, remains relatively at where it is, or perhaps a little higher because that's where it seems to be heading, then this is a combination that produces a debt to GDP ratio of 100% of GDP without much having to happen. Now, when you take this into context, to reverse this situation and to turn things around, you need to implement a fiscal package, a fiscal adjustment package, as soon as the next government lands into, the Planalto on January 1st, 2019. So this would be, a package that would have to include spending cuts, but there's not much to cut in terms of spending in the budget in Brazil because of several rigidities, including all the rigidities related to the constitutionally mandated pension benefits and every other benefit that's constitutionally mandated. And you would have to, together with that, impose also an increase. You would also have to increase taxes. What has Mr. Bolsonaro said with respect to taxes? Not much. What he has in his program is a proposal for a tax reform that basically looks at income taxes. So it's just a portion. The Brazilian tax system is, by the way, extremely complex, as you know. It's probably one of the most complex in the world, at least if you follow the measures of the World Bank that look at how much time it takes for people to process their taxes, people and companies. So Mr. Bolsonaro has talked about tax reform, but he has limited his focus to individual income tax. On individual income tax, what he's proposing to do is to exempt the lower income portion of the population, and from then on to institute a flat tax rate of 20% on the remaining of the tax income brackets. There are two things to say about that. A, it's going to create a drop in revenues, not an increase. And B, it's massively regressive in that it affects very much the lower middle class and the middle class and the poor who will be paying, who are outside of this bracket of exemption, and it will benefit the rich quite a bit because that's what flat tax rates do. So his flat tax rate proposal is very populist, is exactly in line with the kind of thing that a populist government would do. Pension reform. He hasn't talked about pension reform much, and he keeps going back and forth on whether or not he supports it. He has said that he does. Then he has said that he doesn't. Then he has said that the current pension reform that is in Congress right now, this is the reform that has gone through all of the hurdles that need to be that these types of reforms have to go through because it's a constitutional amendment. So there are lots of different hurdles that they have to go through in Congress. The current reform that's being that was elaborated under Temer is not good in a lot of respects. It's not going to solve Brazil's medium-term problems, but at least it is a template from which a new administration could work upon, improve, and pass relatively quickly because it has gone through a few hurdles already. There would have to be some more back and forth if you're changing it and if you're amending it, but nonetheless, it is already in the process of being evaluated and of being analyzed. Bolsonaro has been very unclear about what he intends to do with this pension reform. So he has spoken of building on it, he has spoken of throwing it away, and he has done that back and forth again. One day he says he's fine with it, the other day he says he doesn't want it. The last thing he said about pension reform is that actually the one that's there is not that great, and so what they may do is just not go with it altogether and start from scratch with a new pension reform. Nobody starts from scratch a new pension reform and gets that done and gets that through Congress within a matter of a few months. Doesn't happen that way, especially when you have a new Congress in place, which even if they are broadly aligned with Bolsonaro in the first few months, they're going to be in the process of discussing this reform. It's going to be unpopular, so it's going to be a very difficult, few months, even if they do support the reform in whatever form it comes. Now, again, I come back to my point. If he's a populist, if that's our premise, he's a populist of a different sort, but he's a populist, he's not going to be wanting to push through any kind of reform that really addresses the underlying fiscal issues that Brazil has. So I think the best that we can expect from Mr. Bolsonaro, if he does approve a pension reform at all, is something that is worse than what is currently sitting in the Congress and hasn't been yet voted upon. So that's a second point I want to make. And I can't stress enough how deeply important those 2 points are, because at the moment, in Brazil and elsewhere, financial markets at least seem to be taking this whole thing in stride and seem to be thinking that, oh, this is great, we'll get rid of the PT and we'll finally do the pension reform. It's not that simple. It really isn't. So those are 2 points that I wanted to make. On privatizations, which his chief economic advisor, Paulo Guedes, has spoken a lot about, Paulo Guedes initially had this plan of including in the privatization plan companies like Petrobras, which would be a problem because Petrobras is a monopoly in certain areas of oil and gas production and extraction. So you can't exactly privatize a monopoly. You have to open the sector first. But Petrobras was on the list. Eletrobras, which is the electrical company, state-owned company, was on the list. Banco do Brasil, a public commercial bank, was on the list. And Caixa Econômica Federal, a mortgage lender, was on the list. These were the 4 assets, big state assets that Mr. Paulo Guedes was speaking of, plus a whole bunch of other smaller state-owned assets that they could potentially sell. And on the basis of this, he was saying that he would generate enough revenues to attack or to address the fiscal problems that Brazil is facing initially. Mr. Bolsonaro has already said that actually, as it turns out, these 4 companies are, and he used a word that is reminiscent of a lot of things that Dilma Rousseff, Brazil's former president, used to say. These companies are strategic. So because they're strategic, you cannot sell them. So he's not going to be privatizing Petrobras. He's not going to be privatizing Banco do Brasil. He's not going to be privatizing Caixa Econômica Federal. And he's not going to be privatizing Eletrobras. So the privatization plan that people seem to be still sort of riding their euphoria on really doesn't exist. There is no privatization plan. There are a number of other reforms that Brazil needs to do in addition to that. Brazil has a financial sector, and for those that have heard me speak here at the Wilson Center, this is an issue that I keep insisting on. Brazil has a financial sector that is very highly distorted by a number of things, including the role of these public banks, not just BNDES, the Public Development Bank, but also Banco do Brasil. Because what is the purpose of how does the system work? There is a lot of so-called directed credit. This is credit that goes straight to specific sectors in the Brazilian economy that are tied to subsidized rates or to lower than what the market rates would have been. This creates, because this level of directed credit is equivalent to about 50% of total credit in Brazil, it is a very high level that hugely distorts market rates. So one thing that Brazil needs to address urgently is the directed credit issue. But this is never going to be addressed because guess what? A lot of the directed credit actually goes to agricultural producers. And guess who the agricultural producers are? They're the big guys in Congress who are currently supporting Bolsonaro. So nothing's going to be done on the financial distortion side. Nothing's going to be done on the financial sector side. Trade and investment. He's spoken loosely about, promoting trade and opening up the Brazilian economy. I don't think he quite realizes what that would entail because it would mean removing the protections that are currently in place for some sectors of the Brazilian economy. Specifically, the oil and gas sector has already seen the removal of some of this, but Brazil uses extensively something called local content requirements, which are basically requirements that you produce, that you source a certain amount of what you produce locally. Removing that would be very difficult politically because it would go against a lot of special interest, specifically in the manufacturing sector, but also in other sectors in Brazil. So is there any chance that you open up the Brazilian economy without removing local content requirements? No, not really. So there we have another problem. So wrapping this all up so that I don't talk too much, Brazil has gone back to this, when we always fluctuate between, do we want a more market-led economy? Do we want a more state-led economy? And we always end up, with a more state-led economy. That's where we always end up. And right now, even if you take into account that, oh, Mr. Bolsonaro has a very market-friendly chief economic advisor that he's not letting speak because his chief economic advisor is currently not talking. It's other people in the campaign who are talking about the economy and the economic plans. If you then put it all together with him, with the idea that he is a populist and he does have populist inclinations, and you add it all up, we come to a point where ultimately Brazil is not going to be a market-led economy. It's going to continue to be what it has always been. It's going to be mostly a state-led economy. So bottom line, we are going to be facing some very, very big issues come January 2019. And from then on, I think we are running a risk, at this point, we are running a risk of, at some point down the road, facing some kind of severe fiscal turbulence, given that these reforms are not going to be put in place.
Okay, thank you very much, Monica. Now we'll hear from more on the political side. Congress, Brito has a lot of experience. Yesterday, actually, we were together when he sent a message to a famous, important gaúcho, who is thought to be, or is speculations in the media that he's going to be the next chefe da Casa Civil minister, which is Congressman Onyx Lorenzoni, who participated actually with us here in one of our innovation congressional missions, etc., from Rio Grande do Sul. So Brito has a good reading of Congo, although it's changing. He knows the dynamic of Congress. Brito, do you agree that initially Bolsonaro will have no problem having support for his plans, whatever his plans are?
Just to defend myself, I don't have experience with this kind of Congress. Thanks, Soter, for the invitation, and that's a great pleasure to be with Monica and Fernando. And I think that's a big mistake when we talk about Brazil, to try to analyze what happens today or in the past with ideological lens. The right and the left, stricto sensu in Brazil, both never were more than 20%. The left, 20% in the right. So we are not facing now a victory of the right. Bolsonaro is from the right, but his victory isn't from the right only. Mr. Bolsonaro is the victory of the PA, the party against. Against what? Everything. Everything. So Mr. Bolsonaro was born in the same day when the traditional parties in Brazil, the most important leaders in Brazil, the best economists in Brazil, the best journalists in Brazil, started to be defeated by the common enemies of the common Brazilian: violence, corruption, poverty. Let's go back to the start point of this phase of the Brazilian democracy. 1986, the victory of the democracy. The key point at that time was democracy or the old regime. The word, the magic word, was democracy. 3 years later, the so-called New República created a mess in the country, and Collor won. Collor was Mr. Against. 5 years later, the inflation was, I don't know where, the hill. And the center of Brazil, 60% of the population, the same that said democracy and that said against, said, let's fight against inflation. Fernando Henrique Cardoso, 2 terms. But the victory against inflation doesn't bring a good level of life, of employment. So the same part of the people, and the majority of the people, said social benefits, employment. Mr. Lula, Dilma, and Dilma. And after, I don't know, almost 40 years later, we came back to the beginning. Except inflation, we have the same old problems. Unemployment, violence more than ever, corruption more than ever. It's time to vote against. So what we are facing, in my opinion, isn't a defeat of the democracy, and Brazil is under a threat to be Venezuela or another. No, forget it. We are going to be a mess. We're going to be a mess, a democratic mess, a beautiful democratic mess. A beautiful democratic mess. The question isn't democracy or not. The question isn't right or left. The question is work in a rational way to solve old problems related with the structure of the state, the economy, the trade balance, innovation, or try to do it in a simple way, as Monica said. Mr. Bolsonaro is the Mr. Simple Way. Huh? Yes. But that's not the worst problem. The worst problem is the Congress. Let's imagine that Fernando Henrique Cardoso was elected Sunday with this Congress, the new Congress.
How many parties now? 31 compared to?
It's 25.
25?
Right now.
Okay. 25 right now. We are going to go to 31.
We're going to go to 21. It's going to reduce because because
of the barrier.
There's a new rule, yes.
Sorry, but I disagree. It will be 0. It will be 0 because the way that the Congress is organized isn't by parties, except PT. It's organized by unions, churches, populists,
interest groups. Yeah.
So what the new Congress will think in the next months? First, I think they are especially conservative. That means a defeat for minorities, diversity, the new agenda. They will defeat, and that's very important here in the US, the environment agenda. As Fernando and Monica told, it will be almost impossible to have strong and clear reforms approved by this Congress. Part because they are populists, and in the other hand, because they are so linked with old interests in Brazil. Now, if you join both worlds, Bolsonaro world and the Congress world, I prefer to say what's not going to happen. First, in my opinion, no threat to democracy. Second,
to democracy.
Huh?
No threat to democracy.
Yeah. Second, no way to strong and clear reforms. And no way to clear political decisions. We'll have emotions. Probably they will approve, I agree with Monica, they will approve some economic measures at the beginning. But for each one bill sent by the president, the Congress will reduce, change, modify all bills, all bills. What's going to happen? Clearly a conflict between what the country needs urgently and what Bolsonaro will propose and or the Congress will endorse. No? And another problem, Bolsonaro is, how to say, he doesn't understand what's going on. We have a serious problem to imagine one guy going to the office to look, Mr. President, we have a problem. The trade balance, like some current talks in the Oval Office.
Kanye West.
It's for me. I work with Bolsonaro in the same Congress 1 century ago. I can't imagine how, Mr. President, I'm from Itamaraty, and I have 3 important global issues to discuss with you in multilateral or bilateral questions. For me, and that's my last point, I'm not concerned what will happen in January. I'm really concerned what will happen in July. After this bubble.
After the honeymoon.
Huh?
6 months of honeymoon, is that correct? Is that the calculation?
Yeah.
6 months.
And not only related with honeymoon, but when the conflict between Paulo Guedes, the new finance minister, the team of Bolsonaro, the Congress, the populism, the fiscal reforms, what will happen after the first moment? The first moment is easy, I think, to imagine. A mess. A mess. Not a tragedy, a mess. Okay. But after that, and Paulo, my personal feeling is that it's time for people who works on the relation between Brazil and US, the people who works in the academy, the best sectors of the press, to think about July. To think about July. When Collor was going to the end, there was a B plan. We discovered a magic idea to change Collor's cabinet for a cabinet of honorable people. When Brazil was going to a very problematic situation with Itamar Franco, we discovered a magic solution. Let's make a cabinet to unify the country. What's the next B plan? Bowl from Monica Bowl?
Yes. No, ma'am.
So that's the simple question I have for you, please, if you could answer me.
Yeah, Joel, you have the first question, please. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question. But I will use the privilege here as being the host and ask one question. What is the time frame for pension reform of the fiscal situation? Because some people think that without reform in 2 years or a year and a half or 1 year, and it's particular for some Brazilians that are of a certain age and already receive money from the retirement plan. When is the thing going to sink and will happen at the federal level? What has happened already is happening at the state levels, where some states are no longer paying on time, or paying the pensions that people were promised. Maybe, Monica, we could start with this, and then Joel.
It is going to happen relatively quickly, because the way that when you look at the demographic trends in Brazil, we are already entering the phase where we're leaving behind the demographic dividend, and we're entering into a phase where the dependency ratios are rising, specifically the old age dependency ratio. And that means that very quickly, your pension spending and your pension benefits balloon, and they start to balloon out of control. So to get and that happens within the next 5 years. But that happening within the next 5 years means that you have to address the problem now.
Okay.
So you have to pass the reform urgently. The Temer government spent the better part of 2 years trying to get this pension reform through Congress, and they failed. Why do we believe that that's going to be any different now? A pension reform that restores sustainability. That's what I'm saying. Not any kind of pension reform that just does something so that markets calm down for a while, and then, a few months later, they realize that everything is still unsustainable.
Okay, thank you very much. Joel.
So, Joe Velasco, Bright Stonebridge. I guess I'm going to do what we call in Brazil a conta de padeiro, sort of back of the envelope calculation, but because I want to get to this Bolsa Familia discussion we had in the beginning. And I'll just stick to reais because I think it's easier. But so you got a budget of about $1.5 trillion reais. About 40-something% of that, let's call it half, just to conta de padeiro, goes to pension. Half of that pension goes to civil service employees and the like, which, by the way, are only 2.2 million people, I think, total. So let's just call it 2 million. So half of the budget and goes to pension, half of the pension goes to 2 million people.
There are 35%. Yeah, there are 34 million people receiving pensions in Brazil from the private sector.
1 month of the civil service, let's call it simplified, pension system covers Bolsa Familia for an entire year, which is 30 million reais in dollars. It would be called peanuts. We'll spend more in the recovery probably of the hurricane in Mexico, in the Panhandle, than Brazil spends a year in Bolsa Familia to help 14 million people. If a guy gets elected, here's my question. If a guy like Bolsonaro gets elected, as Fernando pointed out, not on the backs of Bolsa Familia, but really of what I would say, what we would want to say in the U.S., middle class or southern part of Brazil, the farmers and so forth, why can't he just take on the civil servant pension system? I mean, he solves a huge problem if he can address just that part. I think I know why, but I just want to put it, why can't we deal with that?
That's right. Fernando.
Yeah. Well, Joel, I think one should differentiate the public discourse during the campaign and the policies that actually would be implemented when someone is sworn in office. I have to talk to all these guys almost on a daily basis, including Bolsonaro or Fernando Haddad and Paulo Guedes and all those people, and Onyx Lorenzoni, who would be a very important official in an eventual Bolsonaro's administration. And what they say is a little bit contradictory what they say in public to what they say in a more lengthy conversation about the economic scenario in 2019. I think once he is elected, Jair Bolsonaro, I'm saying here, I think he will change a little bit his policies that have been said during the campaign, this election cycle. He has to win. And right now, he's not saying anything controversial in order just to keep things in place. He will win. And I think he will strive to do some sort of social pension funds reform even before he is actually inaugurated on the 1st of January of 2019. Although he's saying he's not doing that right now, I think he will be offered that by the current government. He will be offered that. And think about this current Congress. More than a half of them, the congressmen, will be out next year. So it's not that expensive for them, politically speaking, to vote in favor of that. So that will be the best case scenario. I think he might do something like that. And if he does not do that, if he wastes that opportunity, that will be very bad for him. So we must wait 2 weeks more to see what will be his decision.
Well, I think it's impossible to imagine that in the next 8 months, the last 2 from Temer's administration and the first 6 from Bolsonaro, if he wins. I don't think it's impossible to imagine that the Congress will reject all reforms. Oh, yeah. There will be a reform on pension. There will be some fiscal reform. That's not the question. The question is, because of the populism, those reforms will be insufficient for the Brazilian needs. Let's give you an example. They started to say about pensions, yes, we must reform, but we must understand some Brazilian peculiarities. So let's make exceptions for people from the north, the military, people from the. 1 second, please. Yeah. So we'll have reforms. That's not the question. The question is what kind of and for long.
Money.
I fully agree. I fully agree with I completely share with those views. I just want to add one thing on Bolsa Familia to really drive home the point that you started to make, and I thought you were going to make a different point than you ultimately did. And it's also a conta de padeiro. It's also a back of the envelope, but it really illustrates the issue of Bolsa Familia, I think, very well. Currently, Bolsa Familia is equivalent to people receiving about 170 reais per month. 170, 180, yeah, it's because it is so lagged. When you look at the UN poverty rate, going by the current exchange rate in Brazil, by the UN poverty rate, Brazilians should be receiving to be above the poverty line. They should be receiving about 230 to 250 reais per month. That's what they should be getting. So Bolsa Familia currently is way below the UN poverty line. What could you do with Bolsa Familia? And this, it astounds me that none of the candidates, specifically the ones who are more on the center left, did not pick up on this issue. It would have been sort of an obvious one, and no one did. If you take the 170 to 180 reais and you double that to 360 so that you are above the poverty line, the amount that would imply for the budget in Brazil would be equivalent to 25 to 27 billion reais, which out of the trillion something reais that the budget entails is nothing. Now, why did no candidate, Marina, Alckmin, Ciro Gomes, all of them defenders of social programs, and all of them defenders of Bolsa Familia and everything else that was put in place in the country. Why did no one speak of this issue? Because I think we would have seen something perhaps different from what we saw play out.
Bolsonaro did, actually. Did you see that? He's
During the campaign?
Well,
No.
yeah, last week, yeah. He
Last
said
week.
he's going to introduce what we call in Brazil,
the
13º, the 13th. Well, because Bolsa Familia is paid in 12 installments all over the year. He's going to, his proposal is to give a
Additional
13th one by December every year. Yeah.
But again, you during the campaign, these other candidates had all the opportunity in the world to use this issue and to talk about it, and not in populist terms, because this is actually good policy. It's not populist policy, it's good policy. No, they handed off the issue to Bolsonaro, and now he's the guy who's probably going to be marginally increasing Bolsa Familia, because that's not really his base. He knows it,
Yeah,
he'll be
I was
doing
just
other
going to say, I agree with all you guys said. Bolsa Familia, it's not just astounds me there was this election. I mean, this goes back to Fernando Henrique Cardoso. Fernando Henrique had just said, you know what, I'm going to give up a bunch of other programs, but I'm going to double down on Bolsa Familia. PSDB probably would have been in power to this day.
It was then called Bolsa Escola. Lula, Chico, Francisco Gaetani. Chris. Yes.
Three very brief questions. Fernando, do you think that global may play a major role in these 2 weeks in terms of affecting the final results?
What is the question? Global.
Global.
Yeah.
Whether television global will play a role.
Monica, how long do you think that the markets will, the amount of time they will demand for consolidating a view of the government, of the chance of the new government, if they will rely or they will not rely in this economic theme? And Rito, I think that you mentioned this point about the Congress. Do you think that the next Congress will provide the 2/3 majority to Bolsonaro?
For what?
No, but let's start by in the order.
Should I pick
What's
up?
that?
Yeah,
Well,
okay.
go first, Fernando.
Yeah, well, Global Group is the largest media company in Brazil, probably the largest media company in the southern hemisphere of the globe. They're very influential still, but I think they are not in the position to influence to the extent of changing the result of the election. What might change the result, as I said before, is some unexpected event that no one in this room would know. But the global group, TV, newspapers, internet, magazines, whatever, let me just give you an example. They stayed like for 6 months doing a very critical coverage of the Temer government when there was that scandal last year, and a foreigner that would arrive in Brazil and tune on the TV Global would say, tomorrow Michel Temer will be put in jail, and he's still in place. So that gives you an example of how limited it is nowadays, the power to influence a election decision from or by TV Global.
And by the way, this was illustrated by the campaign because Alckmin bet all his hopes on the coverage. He had a lot of time on television and regular TV time for propaganda that the government buys and distributes among parties. Had really no influence at all.
Let me add one thing to this before I answer the market question. I think there's one thing that's happening very clearly in Brazil, and Fernando probably is going to agree on that. It's similar to what we saw happen here in the U.S. The traditional media is very discredited in Brazil at the moment. And what you see is people basically saying, I don't trust anything that Globo says, or I don't trust anything that I see on, traditional media. I only trust what I get in my WhatsApp group and whatever people circulate in my WhatsApp group. So that's happening. There's been a lot of erosion of the perception of the media by the population. Bolsonaro is obviously not helping that at all because he's playing by the rule book of saying that everything that the traditional media puts out is fake news, and he's been using that quite a bit. So he's undermining also the traditional role of the media, which goes to the point that that role is much diminished for several reasons, including that one. On the market, markets are very fickle, and they like to sort of just go with the flow and go with the circumstances. So the current wave is, or the current thinking is, everything will be fine. There's going to be some kind of reform, So since there's going to be some kind of reform, we're fine. We have no issues. As long as some kind of reform is put in place, maybe the economy can start growing again at some point soon. And, we'll all use the current opportunity that we have to make money to make some money. That changes fast when whatever reform passes, people go back, they sort of do not exactly a back of the envelope. They have more sophisticated models than that, but they do, the actual numbers, they do the math, and they come up and realize, oh, this is actually not sustainable. Then markets will change their tune and they will say, oops, this isn't going to work. At some point, we're going to have to reopen this issue. And then things change. When does that happen? I don't know. As I said, markets are very fickle. It's possible that we will be riding this euphoric, very euphoric Bolsonaro wave for quite some time. It is astounding to me that when you speak to people from big banking groups like Itaú and Bradesco and others, everyone in the financial markets, everyone is absolutely bought on the idea that it doesn't matter what kind of reform is done. As long as some kind of reform is done, we buy a few months and, we're good. We can make some money for a few months more. At some point, that tide changes. It always does. It always changes. When does it happen? Is it in the first 4 months? Is it in the first 6 months? Is it a little bit beyond that? Who knows? That's very hard to say. But when it does happen, I think we're back to this scenario of a lot of turbulence, potential paralysis, because then Congress comes in and starts to reflect, whatever is going on in the social political scene in the country, and then in the end you get paralysis, you don't get the fiscal adjustment you need, and then you're smacked into the fiscal problems, which Temer managed to avoid because he did things very smartly. He put in a spending cap and he did a number of things that basically threw all the fiscal problems into 2019. The next president is not going to have that luxury.
Brito, you wanted to address?
First, just one word about the media. During the last 20 years, despite all meetings, everything we did, the media contributed in Brazil for the failure of the politics, with just one mistake. They didn't divide mistakes from some politics and other politics. And this election sent to home many extraordinary guys that will be fantastic in the future. Cristóvão Buarque, José Fogaça, and a lot. Because it was easy. The politics. They care. In the future, we'll call, como é o italiano? Berlusconi. Take care. We're going to the failure of all. Second answer. The question is, support for what? For, let's talk about a hospital. For surgeries, I don't believe. For traditional treatments with a small part of pain, probably.
Okay. Questions? Yes, there. Please identify yourself.
Alex Sanchez, I'm a defense analyst here in Washington. I was wondering if you could talk more about the relationship between a potential Bolsonaro administration with the armed forces, especially spending and the budget. We all know the Brazilian military is very ambitious. They just bought a carrier, the Atlantico. They have the submarine program going on. The Air Force wants to buy new helicopters, new warplanes as well. So do you think that if Bolsonaro is elected, will the Brazilian military get a sort of like a blank check for the next few years? And also, you talked a lot about citizen security. Do you really believe that Bolsonaro will send more of the armed forces than they have already been deployed to the streets as sort of like, populist, simple answer to the security problem that is currently going through the country? Thank you.
I don't see him signing a blank check to the military, but I foresee a bright future for the budget of the military in the coming months. That's for sure. For one, he said he will not include the military in a possible pension fund reform. So that's something already. And I think he will have some plan for new equipment being bought, and it's going to be a better time for the military in the coming months. The limit to that will be the whole budget of the country and the extent of the economic crisis that will come out just after that, as everybody is, I think, agreeing here on the panel that in 6 months or 12 months, Brazil will have to face another a double dip in this economic crisis where it is already right now.
On defense, there may be a very interesting development. Let me point this out. You know that Boeing and Embraer have an agreement in principle, okay? And Bolsonaro, the only thing I heard about this, Bolsonaro made some positive noises about that. That would be, by the way, the type of thing that Ambassador Luigi Einaudi, a member of our board here, a wonderful friend, wrote a piece about 10 years ago saying that what Brazil needs and the United States need is not strategic relations, they need strategic engagement. And this would be the exact type of thing which would get the supply chains going, and obviously Embraer aircraft is already its most important market is here. 50% of the avionics come from here, would be something, and it's supported by even important voices in the Air Force like Coronel Osiris Silva, who is the person that built this modern Embraer. So from there you could come, but maybe we'll have time to talk a little bit more broadly on Brazil-U.S. relations. That is another topic. Who is next? Juan, I think Juan had, and then Gabriela, I'll come to you. Yes.
Juan Luna from George Washington University. One of the I just read an article on the foreign affairs issue, and it talked about the electoral system in Brazil. And I would like if Antonio or one of the panel members can address, this issue about the need of reforming the political electoral system in Brazil. Because like you mentioned, there's been an increase in political parties, but the whole issue with the electoral college. And so if you could also address that issue, I appreciate it. Thank you. Antonio?
What will be your opinion if I ask you your opinion if you are in favor or against your suicide? How do you vote?
Would you commit suicide? That's the question. And your own suicide. No, but let me make it more difficult. Actually, there is a political reform now.
It's going on.
It's
yeah.
going on.
If I might say something, can I say something?
Explain that, please.
Well, let me put that into a context. We had a military dictatorship that loved the two-party system in the United States. So the mano militari, they decided that we should have only two parties, and they committed a disaster. And we, for 2.5 decades, almost had only two decades, had two political parties only. If you wanted to be with the government, this is your party. If you want to be the opposition, this is the consented party that you should be in, which was, of course, abnormal. After that, in 1980, when democracy restarted to flourish in Brazil, there was the multi-party system that we have now. What happens then? Because we had this restriction in the past, there was a lot of facilities being given to the ones who wanted to build up a party, which was good, almost like Mao Zedong, like might the 1,000 flowers flourish or something like that, and then they flourished in Brazil. And now I think the pendulum is going to the other side. We are to the peak of the number of political parties in the Congress right now. We have 25. Next year, because of the rule that was enacted last year in Congress, there is going to be still a law, 21 political parties fully represented in Congress. And this transition, very unfortunately, will end only in 2030, when, according to the present and current rules inscripted in our Constitution, there will be around 6 to 7 political parties fully operational in the country. It will take a while. It will take a while, but this is democracy. Unless you have an autocracy like in China or whatever, or in Russia, this is the way it should be done. And again, let me say something positive for our politicians. They voted that against themselves twice. They voted that back in the 90s, and the Supreme Court wrongly overruled that. Yep. And then they voted against themselves, and it's in place now. So I think there is a misconception of the way politicians are portrayed, like Antonio Brito said, like the media says, well, politicians, they're all bad. They are not all bad. In this case, they did a good rule, and it's the political reform is in place, but it will take a while, like 12 years from now.
Okay, Gabriele, to rebut.
This topic of U.S.-Brazil defense cooperation, actually about Venezuela. Curious to see if you think we can expect in a Bolsonaro administration a much more, let's say, active role in handling the Venezuela crisis, and perhaps even potentially involving the Brazilian military.
Well, we spoke to his son. His son is going to have his son, Eduardo Bolsonaro. He's a congressman from São Paulo, was elected with about 2 million votes. That's historical record in Brazil. He's going to be a very important person in his administration. And he said to a reporter of us, well, we are, yes, considering breaking up with Venezuela when Bolsonaro is enacted in power. So I think he's going to play very hard with Venezuela.
Breaking relations.
Yeah, breaking relations, yeah. We don't know yet whether that's just, campaign talk, or whether that's going to be for real. I think, in a way, in general, he's going to be playing very hard with Venezuela and other countries like Venezuela.
Just go over the question.
Which is very bad.
Now, very, that's a complicated one. So, Bolsonaro would probably want to make some noises that would be seen positively here. Yeah. Huh?
True.
How about, we know what the military in Brazil think about foreign engagements, right? They went to peace missions. They were in Haiti for a number of years, no longer. Yeah. Do you see that if there is a measure that, put your troops where your mouth is and do something there? Venezuela, what's the reaction?
Sotero, let's imagine, and I think it's easy to imagine that in the first months, orally, the diplomatic positions, Brazilian positions, will be more aggressive. Thank you. Okay, but that's not sustainable 6 months later. Huh? For many reasons. And the first and most important reason is the Brazilian public opinion. If you ask about Venezuela, all Brazilians hate what happened. But if you say, look, let's send Brazilian army, no. Yeah. No. And if you look for the most important global conflicts, I think we'll have a fake change in the speech.
Yeah, but that is already happening, by the way. The Brazilian
Yeah.
Itamaraty have been very, very tough on Venezuela lately, so it's not much of a change.
But it's a different kind of toughness, right? And it's a toughness that goes exactly to the point that I was making when I first started my remark. Think of Mr. Bolsonaro as a populist.
Yeah.
As a populist and as someone who is going to be not really doing reforms, but pretending to be doing them, that kind of bluster plays right into his hands. So, you know, he may not send troops to Venezuela, and I very much doubt that he would for exactly the reasons that Brito just said. But it plays really well with public opinion if, you know, he deviates attention away from the fact that the real stuff isn't getting done to, look, we are so much tougher on Venezuela than any other Brazilian government has ever been. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?
And so we have a question here and there. Okay, here. Yes.
My name is Doug Adair. I'm a U.S. citizen, but I've spent the past 13 years as a resident of Salvador, the Bahia. So I'm
Congratulations.
headed back there next
Congratulations.
week. Yeah. Eu sou ameribaiano. But
Ameribaiano.
Ameribaiano. But I'm headed back. I'm a social in the business there, and I've experienced firsthand the increase in violence. And I'm wondering, is there any kind of correlation, any kind of empirical research on the decline in Bolsa Familia payments and the rise in violence in those regions where Bolsa Familia is important?
No, not really. What there is a very strong correlation between the rise in violence and what has happened to the local finances of states and municipalities across Brazil. So this is the other side of the fiscal problem. We've talked about the federal fiscal problem, which is extremely grave and which needs to be addressed by the federal government through pension reform and through other fiscal measures. We have not discussed the even bigger problem of state finances and municipal finances across the country. This is something that the Temer administration has done very, very little about because it is a very complex problem to deal with. And what we have seen across the board, when you look at the numbers across Brazil, is that states like Bahia is not even the worst of them, but the worst states are Rio Grande do Sul, Minas, and
Ceará,
Ceará
Maranhão.
is very bad.
And all the
Ceará,
states,
but there's a fourth big one that is particularly.
Alagoas.
And then as you go down, you have
Pernambuco.
Ceará, and you have Bahia, and you have Pernambuco, and then you go down the list. Everybody has extremely high levels of debt and very high deficits, and they don't generate enough revenues. And a lot of these states actually depend on federal transfers. Not Rio, not Minas so much, but the northeastern states do. And they're not getting the federal transfers right now because of the dire fiscal situation. So this is another one of these very massive, complicated problems that Brazil is going to be facing without actually having any strategy, any plan, anything to deal with. In fact, the local finances issue of the states has been completely ignored by both candidates in this election so far. They don't talk about that. They talk about the broad fiscal issue in very sort of broad terms, but they don't even touch the local problems. And that's I think that's what explains to a large extent what's happened to public security.
Brito, quickly.
Last night I read an article, and I hope it's fake. It was an information from someone from Bolsonaro's team telling that they think to put the federal agents to fight against violence with the Minister of Defense. Until now, exceptionally, the army can fight against the urban violence.
And they don't like to do it.
If he insisted in this idea, it will be a tragedy for the army first, and for him, for the federal government.
Let me just add one information. The commander of the Navy was here recently with us, and he told me someone mentioned Polícia Militar, and he said they are not military. It's a misnomer. The Polícias Militares, the state apparatus of public security, they're not military people. And the military people hate the comparison. They hate to be associated with that. And I think we will hear about it if the new government starts sending them to missions. There have been 17 instances in which the military, the armed forces, have been misused in that sense, and by governments of all political stripes. It's not the PT or the PSDB, the right, the left, the center. Question, please.
Two questions. I think I know the answers to both, but I'll ask them anyway. One is mostly for Monica. In 2002-03, when Lula was the Lula doubt and then became president, he then put in Meirelles, he put in Palocci, he put in some people that were considered by the market quite serious, and you saw a wave of investment that had been held off in 01-02 came into the country. And the question is whether you see that a possibility with the beginning of the Bolsonaro administration, assuming he wins. And the second one is there was comparisons between Itamar Franco and Bolsonaro. I think Itamar, while personally maybe somewhat grating, not in a political sense, but he knew what he didn't know. And he was able to bring in people into his administration to patch up areas where he wasn't familiar. From the sense, and Bolsonaro's been a congressman for many, many years. Do you get the sense that Bolsonaro knows what he doesn't know? Those are the two.
Okay. Let me start with the first and say a word, and then I'll pass the rest of the second question to you guys. On your first question, which I got myself thinking about the second. The first. 0203. So Lula 0203. Lula was not a populist ever. You cannot classify Lula as a. So yes, he had a very fiery rhetoric in 2002, when then he had to famously write the letter to the Brazilian people, reneging on all the crazy ideas that he had on the run-up to the election. But because he was never a populist, because he was a pragmatist, and because he was a very intelligent and very savvy politician, he knew that what he had to do in order to succeed was to keep things intact so that inflation wouldn't get out of control. If there was one thing that Lula knew, and knew very well, was that Brazil's greatest trauma was inflation. That was the thing that if he had let it go, it would have hurt his base the most. And so he was entirely cognizant of the fact that he needed to have a macroeconomic framework that kept inflation in check. And that's what he did. And that's what he did in his 2 terms in office. So he had a level of pragmatism and of political savviness, whatever we might think of him today, that Bolsonaro is not even close to that. Not even. Secondly, Bolsonaro is a populist, differently from Lula, in the way that he portrays himself, in the way that he speaks, in the way that, in the politician that he actually is. He is a populist. So in being a populist, he has the typical populist traits, which are not pragmatic. Being a populist is inconsistent with being pragmatic. They're orthogonal. They're not one and the same. And that speaks to a little bit a part of your second question, which is sort of like, so who is really Bolsonaro? Does he know what he doesn't know? Populists never know what they don't know. Or at least if they know what they don't know, that's not how they deal with the situation. So what I would say to that question is, it doesn't really matter if he knows what he doesn't know. The fact is, he's a populist and he's going to act as one.
Okay, any more questions? You have another one. I have a short one. Okay, go ahead. We are coming to an end here, but let's go.
The country is completely paralyzed by the courts, the judiciary, the prosecutors, and the auditors. They suddenly disappeared from the scene. Suddenly, this is... What will happen in a government that does not have a clue about how government works and is suffering from anomie in the next months? I'm asking because I think that the paralysis will be used as a strong political argument for doing strange things. But
By the way, Francisco Gaetani wrote a very important piece on that is published in Estado. I don't remember the date, but it's recently precisely on that one. No, yes, ask your question because I have.
Very quickly, when it comes to U.S.-Brazil relations, Bolsonaro's son has come out and said that under the Bolsonaro administration, they might move the Brazilian embassy to Jerusalem in Israel, that it will be tougher against Iran as well. What do you think about, and that will definitely improve relations between Brazil and the U.S. What do you think about that? Will he actually do it if he's elected? Thank you.
We're going to scrap the Paris Climate Agreement.
Yeah, there is this.
Look,
Do you
we
have an
are still in
opinion?
the campaign.
Well,
Let's wait 2 weeks.
I agree.
There's this anecdote. It's not even Brazilian, but it was adopted that in Brazil it's very difficult even to predict the past, not to mention the future. So it's hard to say actually what is going to happen. I think he's going to be really tough on those questions, and there is a real chance he will move the embassy to Jerusalem. There is a possibility, but we will have to wait and see. But we're gonna have like a half a minute to make a minute. Of
Yeah,
final
we
remarks.
will. Now let me get this question. I'll ask my question and then we wrap up. Yes, go ahead.
Say a little bit more about the commercial agenda. I haven't heard you articulate his views on a commercial agenda, his views on investment, on foreign direct investment, to the extent you can.
Does he have a
He
views on?
doesn't have one. He does not like the Chinese. So yeah, he's made that very, very clear, and that's one thing that he keeps insisting upon during the campaign. Apart from that, he hasn't articulated anything. He has made some sort of remarks about Brazil needing to open itself more, but I would hazard a guess that what that means is Brazil needs to promote more of its exports, but the position's going to be, we like exports, we don't like imports. That's where
Well.
this is heading.
Well,
We like investment, and we love investment. We like investment.
We-
sort of like investment.
We like investment as long as it's coming to us, and we like investment as long as it's not leading us to import more,
okay, let me.
which is actually a problem. Just
Go
for
ahead.
a second, because in Brazil, the two things go hand in hand. When you look at what is the composition of imports in Brazil, the composition of imports in Brazil is essentially capital goods. So when you don't import, you don't invest.
Mhm.
And that's domestic companies. Now, how does he view foreign investment? Of course, he would love to have more foreign investment, but, the strategy has to make sense for investors to want to put their money there.
Let me ask one question, and this is one that he doesn't need to do anything. It's already happening. I think the agency, the National Petroleum Agency, has ran successfully somewhat 5 auctions. Projections are that with the current, what has been auctioned, and if we go through that in the next, I think, the life of those things are 25 years or something like that, Brazil will have an income from what has been auctioned, about 2.2 trillion reais. Do you foresee any change in the auctions in the pre-salt, or that is just something too complicated and they will leave as is? Yes.
They will. If Bolsonaro wins, it's going to be the way it is, I think. Well, that's what I've been told by the team, by Bolsonaro's team. So he's not going to change anything in the rules that we have in place right now for auctions regarding pre-sold.
Okay, in his state, Rio de Janeiro is a great beneficiary of keeping as is. Yes.
So I agree completely on the auctions. I don't think that changes. But there's the issue of prices, fuel prices in Petrobras. And this is a very tricky one because, as you all know, Petrobras has gone through a massive restructuring. Within that framework of restructuring, one thing that has changed completely was the pricing policy of Petrobras, which was previously controlled by the government. So the government was controlling, and the government of Dilma Rousseff was actually freezing fuel prices. That practice was abandoned in favor of something else, which started off as being, sort of regular readjustment of fuel prices whenever there were big fluctuations in international markets, but they were being done on a monthly basis. And then suddenly that changed to a daily basis, and it happened to coincide with when investors became jittery with emerging markets, which led the real to devalue against the dollar. That's when we had the truckers protesting. And a lot of these truckers, when they were on TV, and the leadership of these movements, when they were on TV, they all expressed support for Bolsonaro. So, and Bolsonaro at the time said that Petrobras' pricing policies were crazy and that they shouldn't be done that way. He came out very strongly saying that. He got some backlash for saying it. He became quiet afterwards. Recently, he said again that he is going to change and he is going to interfere. We don't know exactly how, but probably not in a good way, in the way that pricing policies of Petrobras are currently being done. So another issue to watch out for.
Well, let's do a quick final round. I wanted to start to give the floor here to Fernando, but to remind you, some of you, and I failed to mention this at the beginning, Fernando was very instrumental in Brazil he actually is I don't know if he likes us to reveal that, but he is the co-author, actually. He worked with Abrage, with a team of journalists and lawyers and congressmen to produce the Lei de Acesso. Now, the government in Brazil, Freedom of Information Act in Brazil, the government, the public sector that would love to not share information in Brazil, they don't have that option now. So, and we have the Brazilian FOIA, thanks to the efforts of Fernando, led by Fernando and an excellent team of journalists. So I want you to know. And Fernando, with that, I wanted to invite you to make your final remarks, and we will go.
Thanks, Paulo, for your kind words again. It's good you mentioned the Brazilian Freedom of Information Act, because this is another example of how solid, in a way, democracy is in Brazil for the past 30 years. This is a very good piece of legislation. It is in place. It's functioning more well than one would have thought like 15 years ago. It took like a decade to be passed by Congress and then signed by the president. So there are many other legislation in Brazil that make it very difficult for the country to go backwards, because the population got accustomed to have all those rights in place. So my final remarks here are going to be very brief. I would say, is there a possibility of having a disruption in democracy in Brazil next year? I would say from 0 to 10, it's like less than 1, the chance of having that. So it's very unlikely. So that's one point, and that's very important, because that's the bottom line for everything. Are we going to have a reversal of the fortune for the Brazilian democracy? I don't think so. It's going to be a tough time? Sure, yes. Then, will there be any signs of economic recovery in the short term? Probably for superficial reasons, yes. And if you think of Brazil, the size of the economy of Brazil, and the inevitability of having some foreign investments after 2, maybe 4 years of almost nothing significant, I think there will be something coming in. Whether that's going to be sustainable or not, it will depend on how Bolsonaro's team will handle the economy and the administration in the coming months. So I think this is when you look at Latin America, we know how pension funds, how investments flow away in the globe. If you have to invest in Latin America, where you would invest? Oh, Chile is much better. Well, sure, but Chile has an economy the size of the greater São Paulo. That's something different. So I've been talking to many big companies, international companies in Brazil, just waiting for the new president to be sworn in, and then they will have to do something because they have to be prepared for the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. And Brazil will not collapse. It might have like a 4-year term very bad, but then it will continue. The country will continue to exist, and they have to be positioned in that country, which is the largest economy in the hemisphere. And with that, I say, is this a positive analysis of the scenario? I would say it's a realistic scenario, because if you read with all the media, what we have been writing, sometimes you get the idea that it's going to be an abyss, may collapse next year. It might happen, but I don't think democracy is at risk. I don't think, and I think still we have a slight chance of having some good measures being taken. Why not? I don't know. I think we have passed through much worse situations than this. Oh, yes, you know that. José Sarney, Collor, even the beginning of Lula's. So I think it's a difficult time, but it's not the worst of times.
You know what
With that, I
happens
close.
when you are the oldest in the room, you get observations like that. You know that. Bad things happen in the past. Now, Monica, to you, a question. Expectations could not be higher, and they are going to be even higher. And Bolsonaro kind of, promote that. So considering, and I know the economists love to think about managing expectations.
Well, my own view about expectations is, the higher they are, the biggest the disappointment. So that's what I think is going to happen. There will be this, initial movement that markets and investors might, move into Brazil. By the way, there are greater opportunities in Mexico, I think, than there are in Brazil at the moment. Mexico being the second largest economy that just managed to renegotiate and go through a very tough renegotiation with the U.S. We don't know yet where that's going to go, but nonetheless, it is an economy that currently presents a much more stable scenario than Brazil does. That being said, yes, I do see a movement, on the part of companies that want to exploit the opportunities in the country and that may want to come in, if only to test the waters for a little bit, which might, give us a little bit of a boost, but doesn't mean that we are going to be on any kind of sustainable track. If you stare at me like that, I'm going to lose my train of thought. So the bottom line for me is expectations are high. The likelihood of disappointment is very, very big. Once disappointment sets in, there is no plan B. So Brito was speaking about, the previous times when we had very big problems and we were able to call in another economic team and have a plan B. I don't know what the plan B is here if we face problems. And let me finish with one thought. We haven't talked about the external scenario and the external conditions that this government's going to face. So let's take a minute to think about that now. There's a trade war going on between the U.S. and China. Yes, that's affecting the soybean market in Brazil in a very positive way, but that's not necessarily going to last. Mr. Bolsonaro has been speaking about very, very, very aggressively against China. What comes out of that? We don't know. There's been a lot of Chinese investment in Brazil recently, and that's actually what's held up the economy somewhat. So what are we going to do? Scare the Chinese off now? Not a good idea. Third, we have in place a scenario for emerging markets that is anything but benign. So in general, investors are more wary of emerging markets than they were before, and they have good reason to be. We have Argentina in crisis. We have Turkish just on the verge of having a crisis. We have other countries that have issues. Indonesia has a lot of foreign currency denominated debt. India has a lot of foreign currency denominated debt. People are a bit scared of what might happen there. Brazil has all the fiscal issues that it does. So we are facing this context, which, if I may say so, reminds me a little bit of the second half of the 90s, where we've had a boom in emerging markets recently, and now that's starting to recede. And at some point, that might turn into, just countries toppling one after the other, perhaps in a very strong way, perhaps in a less strong way. But this is the scenario that the next government is going to come in facing. So the external scenario isn't good, and expectations being very high doesn't bode very well, in my view.
Well, thank you. I would like to ask a question to Brito, and we were talking yesterday, and he came up with a metaphor that, in these times in Washington, it can be used, but I love it. It's not very Wilson-centric, but I will say it. Basically, the metaphor is that the chair, meaning the presidential chair, shapes your behind, okay? You sit there, and that's the chair.
I said this.
You said that. Now, which I find it's a good one. I find it's a good one because on the 1st of January, if he is elected, Mr. Bolsonaro will sit there, and we'll have to make decisions. And you told me the bubble, right? The speculative bubble about, and so, boom, you burst the bubble. So, Brito.
No, just to tell a short personal story, I've been working for the pharmaceutical industry in the last 10 years. And in the first years, receiving a lot of people from other countries, they went to São Paulo, Brasilia, and tell me, wow, Brazil is fantastic, paradise, enthusiastic. And my job was, take care, we have problems, the pension problems, In the last years, the same people went to Brazil to say, look, that's a tragedy, Dilma. And my job was, take care, we also have democracy, market. The final word is, if you want to think about Brazil, think that we hate straight lines. We love curves.
Big ones.
Big curves. Thank you. Yes, let's stop right here because it's getting okay.
Well,
people.
I can say that actually.
Yes, you can say. Well, not. Guys, thank you very much. It has been, I think, a wonderful discussion. We will produce a report on this, the most detailed, I hope, and we will continue to. We have a series of discussions coming. You will be informed, but please let's offer a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much.